One of the symbols of the Victorian era is without a doubt the workhouse. Now, you may remember it as the place where Oliver Twist famously says, "Please sir, I want some more." And wonder, was it really as bad as Charles Dickens made it out to be? We had our cook live on a workhouse diet for a fortnight, and after this we are actually not sure he wants more. Workhouses, also known as poorhouses in some regions, were institutions, usually run by the local parish, where poor people could get room and board in return for some work. These could be things like laundry or carpentry, but also much heavier work like the breaking of stones. Some people who worked for the parish poorhouse but didn't live there could also get some pay. This was called out relief. A common poorhouse worker could be a farmhand making ends meet when there was no work on the farms. That doesn't sound so bad. So what caused these places to become the backdrop of horrid Dickensian drama? Turns out the parish workhouse was no match for the might of the Industrial Revolution. We won't go into too much socio-economic details here, but there were, among other things, the displacement of large classes of people to urban centres. And this in turn meant that the era of parochial, localized poor relief was no longer fit for purpose. You might reasonably think that assistance for large-scale redundancy and huge demographic shifts would require a nuanced approach. However, the government at the time was convinced that the old system's failures were simply because those soft, hippie parish poorhouses had made everyone lazy. So, in 1834, they introduced new poor laws, removing the responsibility of poor relief from the parishes and placing it in the hands of government officials and specialized public companies called poor law unions. There would be no more out relief. If you wanted help, you had to live in the workhouse, and the emphasis was now firmly on the work part of that word. New designs for these workhouses were also being introduced. They would no longer be just houses in a community. No. The Victorian workhouse resembled a prison, where men, women and children were kept separate. You got a family? Tough. Looks like you were only seeing each other once a week. If that. If you were able-bodied, you would also be forced to do hard labor, like crushing bones or making fertilizer, doing laundry or picking oakum. The economic benefit of such work was usually negligible, especially with the dawn of machines. The main purpose of that work was to punish those seeking help. The workhouse had to be harsh and nasty, so as to motivate the pauper to become economically active. If the message wasn't clear enough, just know that the term for a workhouse resident is inmate. And our inmate will be living on a workhouse diet for 2 weeks. We start in 1835, where the menu is based on the freshly published dietaries from the Poor Law Commission. This might be the Industrial Revolution, but the incandescent light bulb is still a twinkle in the eye of the man Edison will eventually nick it from, so the schedule is still very much dictated by the sunrise and sunset. That means in spring and summer we get up at 6 in the morning. For breakfast there is 180 grams of bread. The type of bread depended on what people had locally. In the west of England it would often contain barley, and in other places it would be heavier on rye. We're going with a wholemeal wheat and rye bread here. Now, just this bread would be rather dry, so there is something else. Thin porridge, better known as gruel. Yes, the iconic Victorian workhouse gruel, the slop of which Oliver Twist wanted some more. Now you might think, rye bread and porridge, that's what I had for breakfast. Only if you serve your bread dry, in that it is dry bread, there is nothing on it. As for the porridge, here's the recipe from a workhouse. 1/2 ounce of oatmeal per pint of water. Boil it. 14 grams roughly of oatmeal for 1/2 liter, again roughly, of water. And that's if we're being generous. The elderly and infants might have had their gruel enriched with some sugar or milk, but an able-bodied worker, like him, didn't. He didn't even get a pinch of salt. Remember, all of this is punitive in nature. After a bland meal, it's time for a day of hard labor. Okay, that's pretty hard work. It is. But you should suffer a bit more. It doesn't need to be useful, just hard. There we go, that's much better. And as the clock strikes 12, it's time for dinner. Yes, back then, dinner was the midday meal. The evening meal was called supper. Still that way if you're very posh. Dinner was the biggest meal. And for dinner, yes, get used to it, we are having soup. The model dietary doesn't specify which soup, but we're going with Alexis Soyer's Soup for the Poor. This soup might be nicer than the other items on this week's menu, but that's because it's from Soyer, who thought the poor needed help, not punishment. It's a Victorian recipe, which Mrs. Crocombe even once made. Fry up some bacon in butter, then use this to sweat some onion, carrots, celery, and give it some texture by adding pulses like split peas, chickpeas, or dried mung beans, which we've soaked overnight. Pour vegetable stock and season with mint, pepper and salt. It's a good, nutritious soup. If you want a more authentic workhouse experience, leave out the pepper and undersalt it. Then for supper, it's 170 grams of bread, again dry, and a 56 gram piece of cheese, usually made locally. Then it's off to bed at 8 o'clock. Yes, even in spring and summer. The next day, breakfast is exactly the same. Dinner, again that's lunch, consists of 150 grams of cooked meat, and we've used the remainder of Sunday's roast and 250 grams of potatoes. Boiled. Want gravy? Well, tough luck, you should have worked a bit harder. Now again, off to do some heavy labour, and for supper it's 170 grams of bread with 850 millilitres of broth. Wednesday is a repeat of Monday and Thursday a repeat of Tuesday. At this point, we asked our cook for his impressions. Look over here, please. Not over there, over here.
These first couple of days were really hard. From Monday evening onward, I had a near constant headache. And I was also very often dizzy. On Tuesday, I did some calculation and discovered that I was only getting 1,300 calories maximum. So I did supplement that a bit with a protein bar and a shake before bed.
Not everyone who was poor went to the workhouse. A lot of people weren't well off, but made just enough to support themselves outside the workhouse. A very valuable source of how these people lived was a report made in the middle of the 19th century by Henry Mayhew, titled London Labour, London Poor. If you have any interest in the history of the common people of the Victorian era, give this one a read. There's some very colourful stuff in there. On the eating habits of the poor, like costermongers, people who sold things like fish or vegetables at an outdoor stall, the report notes, for example, they breakfast at a coffee stall and, if all their means have been expended in purchasing their stock and none of it be yet sold, they expend on the meal only 1 penny, reserved for the purpose. For this sum, they can procure a small cup of coffee and 2 thin, that is to say thin slices of bread and butter, for dinner. They buy block ornaments, as they call the small dark-coloured pieces of meat, exposed on the cheap butcher's blocks or counters. These they cook in a tap room, half a pound costing 2 pennies. If time be an object, the coster buys a hot pie or 2, preferring fruit pies when in season, and next to them meat pies. "We never eat eel pies," said one man to me, "because we know they often made of large dead eels. We of all people are not to be out that way, but the aristocrats eat them and never know the difference." The traditional food of the London working classes indeed. We can show tons of quotes from this book. It's really interesting. But the main trend we noticed is that the poor outside the workhouse had more palatable options. They got butter with their bread, had coffee in the morning, and sometimes a few drinks on the side. Nicer, but not necessarily as nutritious as a strictly regimented workhouse menu. Some labourers had quite balanced diets though. A good example were the rubbish carters, essentially Victorian binmen. They went round collecting rubbish with a cart, and this required the cart to be pulled by a donkey or a horse. You see, handling the animal was a specialised skill, so there was a finite supply of skilled carters. So even though they had to work very hard, they made significantly more than the average labourer. And their diet reflected this. As to food, these labourers, when in full work, generally live what they consider well. That is, they eat meat and have beer to their meals every day. If these men were engaged on a job at any distance, they sometimes breakfasted before starting, or carried bread and butter with them, and eat it to a pint of coffee if near enough a coffee shop. But in some places, they were not near enough. You see, this is before Costa and Starbucks. Their dinners they carried with them, generally cold meat and bread in a basin covered with a plate. A handkerchief being tied round it so as to keep the plate firm and afford a hold to the bearer. Indeed, you heard that right. Victorian labourers sometimes carried bentos. Meanwhile, in the workhouse, Friday is a special day. Yes, there is suet or rice pudding. Breakfast is still the same though. Suet pudding doesn't mean that you are getting a lovely Christmas pudding. No, this one was mainly flour, bit of suet and some skimmed milk. Oh, and a small dash of salt. But don't worry, we won't be making this. We are making the rice pudding. Yes, a lovely rice pudding made with butter and rich creamy milk would be quite the treat. But this rice pudding is a bit more utilitarian. For our allocated dinner on Friday, we need 85 grams of rice, 15 grams of suet, 15 grams of sugar in a pan to be dissolved in 250 milliliters of skimmed milk. Yeah, there will be no creaminess here. Add a small pinch of salt and then some unspecified spice. We went with cinnamon, but it could also be allspice. And there's your Friday dinner. It's not very creamy. We don't want to call it fancy rice gruel, but it's sort of what it is. Well, at least it's a change, which is good because the weekend has exactly the same fare as Monday and Tuesday. Again, we did take the liberty of making a fresh roast on Sunday though. So that concludes week 1. We're halfway there. How is our cook feeling?
Very glad this week is over. The headaches and dizziness stopped on Wednesday. I didn't need to supplement the diet with protein bars or shakes anymore, and I was fine on days where I didn't have to go out. Anything that required any sort of physical exertion, though, back to feeling dizzy and weak. I was prepared for the bland food when I started this, but the massive calorie deficit, yeah, that hurt. Week 2 should be better though.
It's interesting to note that even though this was what the government said the average menu should look like, not every workhouse copied it. Even though the central government set the budgets, the heads of the poor law unions, called the Guardians, had some discretion. So there was variety across the country. We know from our Lobscouse video that in Liverpool they served scouse in the workhouses. Some unions were significantly nicer than others. In Brighton, the local authorities used a legal workaround to give their inmates a little bit more. Inmates were given beer and tea, there was more meat on the menu, and portions were just much larger. On the other end of the spectrum were workhouses where the Guardians tried to turn a profit on the workhouse. That wasn't the case everywhere, of course, but there was a scandal in the Andover workhouse, which was quite an infamous one. Here, inmates started fighting over the rotting meat that was still hanging off the bones that they were breaking up for fertilizer. We can only show you small snippets from a 2-week change in lifestyle. Therefore, we made another video in a more informal vlogging style where we actually give you a look behind the curtain. That video will be up for members of the well-fed peasant tier and above in a week or 2, something like that. Inmates could technically leave the workhouse, but there were always factors making it slightly more complicated than just walking out the door. One such obstacle was that even though the inmates were all free Britons, they all received a workhouse uniform when they entered the workhouse, and their old clothes were often disposed of. That uniform remained property of their poor law union. So if an inmate absconded, they were often arrested for stealing the uniform. Quite a few people who were deported to Australia in this era were done in for the crime of stealing the uniform. As the 19th century progressed, public sentiment shifted against the harshness of the workhouse system. This was part of larger socio-economic changes, like the dawn of the labour movement and the simple fact that the economy was beginning to adapt to the Industrial Revolution's changes. Laws were being passed that, for example, required children to be educated in the workhouse. They were still pretty grim places, but the overall penal nature of the workhouse was eroding. A little bit. Over a long period of time. This sociological shift and technical innovations like electricity meant that workhouse life at the turn of the century was quite different from the early days of 1835. We get an excellent look into pauper and workhouse life in the late 19th century via Rowntrie's 1901 book, Poverty, A Study of Town Life. Rowntree was a Quaker who had taken it upon himself to chart the state of poverty in and around the town of York. In doing so, he compiled a baseline workhouse menu. This was the minimum the average workhouse inmate would receive, and according to Rowntree, most of them would have been fed a tad more than this. In 1901, an official cookbook was published by the local government board in an attempt to make sure that the food was cooked to a uniform standard. For our upcoming week, we will be using recipes from this book. Before we move on though, could we bother you to please subscribe, or if you're already one of our treasured subscribers, press the like button. It really helps us out with all the algorithm stuff. Thank you very much. Oh, if you want to go over any of these menus, we'll leave all the details, amount and stuff on our website. Now, back to the workhouse. What we found interesting was the clear improvement in how inmates were fed. For Monday breakfast, we get 230 grams of bread, a bit more than the 180 grams of 65 years ago. And on top of that, there's 850 milliliters, same portion as before, of porridge, not gruel. No, this porridge had 8 times more oats than the old gruel, and it now contained a mandated pinch of salt. For the first time in, a week, our cook could not finish his meal. He ended up not even needing the bread that came with it. So, that's breakfast. Now, before we get to dinner, we see another new invention. Lunch. Originally eaten around 11, it's served to bridge the gap between breakfast and dinner. On this Monday, lunch consists of 120 grams of bread and 40 grams of cheese. It will also be this on all other days. It's essentially a cheese sandwich. Very dry though. So if you hear us mention lunch, it's this. For dinner, we get potatoes with milk. That sounds pretty sad, but it's essentially mashed potatoes thickened with flour, making it like an odd sort of bland bechamel mash. Your fat to potato ratio is at maximum 1:10, so you will not be impressing Joël Robuchon with these, but it's already a very welcome bit of variety. The recipe even has the line, salt to taste. Luxury. This is very filling. It's supposed to come with even more bread, but that ended up being not required. For supper, we get 230 grams of bread, again, 56 grams of cheese and a pint of vegetable broth. Not spectacular, but a marked improvement. On Tuesday, we get our usual porridge allowance, but on this day, we get a pint of skimmed milk rather than bread. Lunch. Dinner is the same amount of broth and cheese as the supper from Monday. There's just half the amount of bread this time, but we are getting dumplings. No, not those. For these dumplings, we're making a bread dough. Yes, a full-on bread dough. Flour, water, yeast, salt, all the works. Let it rise for an hour and then, rather than baking it, divide it into smaller balls and boil these. There we go. Enjoy your bland bread balls in broth. For supper, it's 115 grams of bread and the usual portion of porridge. On Wednesday, we're getting our same allocation of porridge for breakfast, but only a fourth of the usual bread allocation. That's because we now get 2 big spoonfuls of treacle in our porridge. Look how happy he is. Lunch. Then for dinner, we get bread, boiled potatoes and boiled bacon, which is exactly what it sounds like. For supper, it's the same porridge and skimmed milk combination we got for Tuesday breakfast, which also happens to be Thursday breakfast. Then lunch. Dinner is the normal 230 gram allocation of bread, with 85 grams of cheese and, wait for it, a pint of coffee. Yep, he's ecstatic. He hasn't had coffee in weeks, you see. Now, before we get too excited, for this 1 pint serving, we are using 8 grams of coffee. A ratio that every coffee nerd will tell you is very weak. But not to worry, we are reinforcing this coffee with about 2 to 3 grams of chicory. Yes, the Workhouse coffee was juiced up with chicory. If you ever talk to people who lived through the Second World War or its aftermath, they might still remember chicory. It was a popular coffee replacement during rationing. These days it's a health food thing which we honestly don't get. It looks like coffee, smells like the memory of coffee, and tastes like nothing. Put this in a little pan with boiling water. Then leave on low heat for 10 minutes to extract its full strength. That's actually in the guide. Draw it off. You can do this cowboy style, meaning you just pour very carefully, or use a filter. They didn't have V60s back then, but they did have muslin cloth and mesh filters, so that's sort of up to you. Now add sugar and milk. Our cook normally takes his single origin white honey processed coffee black, but this one does indeed need some milk and sugar, especially given how lean the dinner was. Supper is just the same as it was on Monday. Now, before we get into the home stretch and end this torture, let's have a look at life outside the workhouse during this period. Rowntree made a very comprehensive account of the social situation of York during this period. It's the work that, according to many, sparked the beginnings of the modern welfare state here in Britain. One big conclusion of his research was that many of the people struggling weren't the lazy layabouts as they were often portrayed. Most of them were in some form of work, but they still couldn't support themselves with what they were paid. He argued that the narrative of the able-bodied work-shy layabout was pure fiction, and stop me if any of this is sounding infuriatingly familiar. It's partly because of Rowntree that at the time young and promising member of parliament, called Winston Churchill, crossed the floor of the House of Commons and switched parties. For a bit. Rowntree's report is filled with examples of how hard times were for people. One of them in particular caught our eye. An unnamed soldier's widow, who Rowntree refers to as Mrs. X, who had 5 children younger than 7. Her husband had died in a lunatic asylum, which meant that she was entitled to a widow's pension. This was a lump sum which wasn't paid directly to her, but to another lady, also left unnamed. From this lump sum, Mrs. X receives 10 shillings a week. On top of that, she had a tea pension. This was a pension scheme set up by a local tea company, sort of like insurance, via tea. She's actually lucky the tea pension paid out, because Rowntree noted plenty of instances where somebody had signed up to a mutual scheme or some other form of grassroots social security, and when they then went to claim from that, the fund didn't have enough money to pay them what they were entitled to. These 2 pensions gave the widow a weekly budget of 15 shillings for her and her 5 children. In today's money, that's just over £77. This wasn't just for food, this was for everything. Rent, heating, food, clothes. Good luck living on £77 a week for yourself and 5 children. The diet of Mrs. X and her children is pretty meagre, even when compared to the workhouse fare. There's more tea, makes sense given the tea pension, and a little bit more meat. However, the meat was mainly cut-offs and offal. Nevertheless, Mrs. X did manage to keep her family out of the workhouse, and her children never missed a day of school. It's actually really impressive when you think about it. Speaking of the workhouse, it is now Friday. For breakfast, we get treacle porridge and bread, just like we did on Wednesday. Lunch. In the 1835 workhouse, we got rice pudding for dinner on Friday. Here, we get the same boiled bacon dish we got on Wednesday. A bit more substantial. And supper. Bread with gruel. This gruel is porridge with half the amount of oats, with some treacle and allspice. Friday night indeed! Saturday is porridge and bread, same as Tuesday's supper. Lunch. Dinner is a bit of a special one. There's a pint of vegetable broth, a good chunk of bread, cheese, and a big chunk of suet pudding. Yes, that's Christmas pudding, but without any of the good bits. Just flour, salt, suet and water, mashed and boiled in a cloth or steamed in a basin. According to the 1901 cookbook, it could be served with either gravy, treacle or, in this case, broth. Happy days! Yes, it's pretty bland, but very filling. After all that decadence, supper is just bread and skimmed milk. The entitlement! Sunday breakfast is a feast. Breakfast is bread, as per usual, but it comes with a new-fangled invention. Margarine. Animal fat made spreadable by injecting it with CO2 gas. Science! Oh, the feast doesn't stop there. On Sunday, inmates get, wait for it, a cup of tea. Yes, because thanks to this guy, remember him, tea was now pretty affordable. So we get about 5 grams of tea per 500 milliliters of water. Unlike with our coffee earlier, this is actually still considered quite a good ratio for black tea. This process would be done in bulk in a big urn with a muslin cloth, so it wouldn't be as nice as the one we're making here, but all in all, still a decent cup. Serve, as per usual, with milk and sugar. Lunch again. Dinner is peas pudding. To make peas pudding, soak split peas overnight, boil or steep in a pudding cloth, then mash with a small amount of fat. This fat can be lard, beef dripping or, if you're feeling fancy, butter. This stuff is, weirdly, pretty good. Serve with boiled bacon. Our last supper in the workhouse consists of, again, bread and margarine, but the drink is no longer just a cup of tea, but a nice cup of hot cocoa. We make this hot cocoa by taking about 15 grams of cocoa and slowly adding in 85 grams of whole milk. The decadence. Combine this on low heat until you get a paste. Then add water until it's roughly a pint or half a litre. Add up to 10 grams of sugar and serve. It's not the best cocoa, but it's still cocoa and we'll take that. So, what did our inmate think of it at the end? Look over here, please. Okay, thank you.
As expected, week 2 was fine. Still bland as chewing on cardboard seasoned with sadness, but a veritable paradise compared to the first week. Just being able to have normal, albeit bland, porridge was a dream. One thing still puzzles me though. In neither of the 2 diets are there any eggs. Or fruit. There are even loads of recipes in the guide that we didn't make, and none of them have eggs either. We know from books like Eliza Acton's cookbook that Victorians ate loads of eggs. Why were there no eggs for the poor? I get that they didn't want to give them alcohol, but what's the deal with no eggs? It's insane. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm about to make the world's biggest omelette. I'm going to need more eggs.
We hope you enjoyed this excursion to the Victorian workhouses. Please like and subscribe if you did. Thank you very much for watching.